now at the outset what we studied was pressure control or volume control, but beyond that, when you start your ventilator, which mode of ventilations you have to choose. So we have controlled mandatory ventilation, intermittent mandatory ventilation, synchronized intermittent mandatory, pressure support ventilation, assist control. So these are the 5 most common modes of ventilation, among which we use SAMV as the most common, isn't it? So we have to understand what are these different modes of ventilator and when do we choose which. So first is a controlled mandatory ventilation. So in the description itself it is very obvious. It is controlled means all the breaths will be from the ventilator, or it is mandatory, all the breaths will be from the ventilator. We set the rate, we set the volumes, the patient is not allowed to take any spontaneous breaths, and it is completely mandatory, right? So the volume is set, the rate is set, and the patient cannot generate a spontaneous breath in this type of ventilation. So when will you choose a controlled mandatory ventilation? When there is no effort at all from the patient, when there is the patient is under heavy sedation, controlled mandatory ventilation can be used, isn't it? Otherwise, the patient will try to take efforts, take the breath efforts, but that will not be supported. So when the patient is awake or the patient is trying to take spontaneous breaths, this mode will result in asynchrony and cause increased work of breathing. So this is controlled mandatory ventilation. For everything is set. Okay, so CMV, where you set the tidal volume, where you set the rate, inspiratory expiratory ratio, how much PEEP, FiO2, etc. Okay, if it is a pressure control mode of CMV, then you set the pressure, right? Coming to the intermittent mandatory ventilation. So intermittent mandatory means there CMV it was completely taken over by the ventilator. Here intermittently, if the patient takes breath, the machine allows the patient to breathe spontaneously also, but the machine also delivers the rates. So what happens in this intermittent mandatory ventilation is, here the machine does not sense the spontaneous breaths or the breaths taken by the patient. So what happens, this is a normal breath, sorry, this is a mandatory breath. Here it is a normal breath which is taken by the patient. So this is not sensed. So what happens is, the breaths keep stacking. Okay. So because of the breath stacking, there is not enough space for exhalation, right? So this can lead to trauma, barotrauma, volutrauma. There will be asynchrony in intermittent mandatory ventilation. So somehow we need to synchronize. The ventilator needs to understand that the patient is also taking breaths, so I have to give some space, right? So in that moment, the patient, when the patient is taking a breath, the ventilator has to support but not give a breath on its own. So then came the synchronized intermittent mandatory ventilation, that is SIMV. So this is what we commonly use, either a pressure control or a volume control. SIMV is what we commonly use, right? As you can see in the graph here. So this is a mandatory breath, right? The smaller ones here, these are all spontaneous breaths. So this is mandatory, this is a spontaneous breath. So this is also allowed by this SAMV with no breath stacking and with very little asynchrony, right? So you set the respiratory rate, you set the volume in case of volume control SAMV, and in SAMV we allow the patient to generate his own efforts, his own volumes and his own flow rates in between the mandatory breaths. So this ventilator will deduct, okay, the patient is breathing, so I will not give a mandatory breath here. So in this way, breath stacking will be prevented in an SIMV. Okay, you got the point. So this is different from pure IMV. Okay, so this is a synchronized intermittent mandatory ventilation.